Hello, my name is Chris Kaliba. I'm an associate professor in community development and applied economics and member of the Complex Systems Steering Committee. And I am pleased to welcome you on behalf of my colleagues in the Complex Systems Center to host this talk by Bob Glass from Sandia National Laboratories. We will have time for questions and answers following Bob's talk, so save your questions up. And we will be asking, when you do ask a question, we'll have a mic, and make sure you're talking to the mic, because we are recording this for posterity and the website, which does get many hits, and it builds a body of evidence for us to show the current thinking in complex systems, and which Bob certainly brings to bear with us. I had the pleasure of first meeting Bob, as many of the faculty in the room did, several years ago when he basically was doing some initial foraging to find out what we are doing over here in complex systems. And Bob met with many of us in our isolated offices, and we didn't have much fanfare for him. At the time, we didn't have a talk for him, and we were just sort of emerging out of the primordial soup, so to speak. And it's exciting to see us just a few years down the road, where we have an established seminar series, we have an established complex systems center. We've got a lot of different projects and a whole cohort of graduate students to spend some time with Bob and sort of tap his wisdom and understanding. So we're evolving, and it's great to have Bob come back. And we hope to have him back again on many different occasions on some collaborative projects. So Bob is, again, from Sandia National Labs. Many of you are probably aware that there's a Vermont Sandia partnership that's emerging around smart grid and renewable energy, and we're excited to see that evolution, and hope that Bob can participate in some of this. Bob's focus on complex systems is truly transdisciplinary, and as we think about complex systems as a transdisciplinary concept, and is represented in, I think, in the next slide here, you'll see that Bob's career trajectory is as muddled as pretty much most of us are, which is we span a lot of different boundaries. And then out of that, though, I think we're making a whole lot of sense. He leads the Complex Adaptive Systems of Systems, CASoS Engineering initiative at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, and he has degrees from Haverford College and Cornell, in which he has an MS and a PhD in agricultural and biological engineering. He's worked for many years in the general field of subsurface science, where his discoveries of phenomena and creation of new modeling approaches have influenced problem solving ranging from water and contaminant transport and fractured rocks, having to do with Yucca Mountain, for example, to the remediation of aquifers and contaminated with dense non-aqueous phase liquids, and I won't go into the acronyms for those. But Bob is, obviously his work is focused on problem solving in a very concrete way. Joining the National Infrastructure Simulation and Analysis Center in 2004, Bob created a research team that has evolved to become the CASoS Engineering initiative, focusing on the analysis and control of complex adaptive systems of systems, which is a pretty cool concept. Is embedded by many of the critical infrastructure and socio-economic and technical systems that he studies. So he's really talking about the coupled nature of human behavior, social systems, and our techno and natural systems. And he'll be sharing, I know, a number of the examples in which his research and modeling work has actually led to some problem solving, which is a novel idea. Bob is currently at Stanford University, where he is the William J. Perry Fellow in the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and his prospectus for this year is entitled Understanding Global Interdependency to Promote International Security. And he's teaching classes out there and helping to spread the word of complex systems to the West Coast. So please welcome in joining Bob and me in welcoming Bob to the
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for inviting me. I always enjoy Vermont. It's beautiful weather. I hadn't expected it at all. I come coming from Albuquerque, I brought all this cold weather gear and I left it all in DC on the way up here. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a path that I've gone through to get to this point, which is designing influence inside of complex adaptive systems of systems, something that we're calling CASoS Engineering. Okay, and that path is really dominated by two things. The first is work in infrastructures and recognizing that they are indeed complex adaptive systems of systems, and then turning around and deciding that I really am an engineer in many ways and I want to solve problems. So I want to design influence. And that combination is what has led us to this initiative, which is something that we hope to others will join in and over time and work with us on. So the roots of this, as I mentioned, was NISAC. And I don't know if anyone knows about what NISAC is, but it was stood up around 2000, and after 9/11, it was moved over to DHS. And it focuses on essentially understanding and designing ways of mitigating disasters inside of our national infrastructures. When we started this, and I got into it, and Teresa Brown, by the way, who's in the audience, led this program, and she's now a co-lead of the CASoS Engineering initiative. When we got into this, and I started looking at it, it was very clear. That there's emergent structure everywhere, of course. This is a little economy here. And if you look at any particular sector, this is data from the petrochemical supply chain. And when you look at it, you find these supply networks which have these features. They have nodes which are like this one right here that has many connections, and then there are a number that have very few. And this kind of emergent structure you just find in every one of these sectors. The second thing, when you scratch your head and start looking over it, stepping back, is that you have a lot of emergent behavior. Now, emergent behavior is something that has been seen in earthquakes and in wars and extinctions, forest fires, things like that. But when you start looking at infrastructures, you see it too, in terms of power blackouts, telecom outages, traffic jams, et cetera. It doesn't always follow a power law, but it certainly is non-normal. And there's almost always a heavy tail region. And these cascades with power laws and heavy tails are indicative of complex systems. So with that, we began this sort of group that started looking at complex systems or infrastructures as complex systems. They're complex because they're really formed by many different interacting parts, which often have local rules, and that yields emergent structure and behavior at larger scales. And they grow and adapt in response to local to global policy. They contain people, and people that throw switches or don't throw them when they're supposed to, et cetera. And by the way, they're also designed for people to meet needs of people and are driven by people, by turning people, lights, et cetera. And so they're all interdependent systems of systems. What I think you can see this most best in terms of infrastructure. You have electrical systems, which you can look at as networks, which come together. You also have economic networks that come together, but they are companies which require the power, et cetera, and the water and all these other things. But systems of systems is no more than what you see in your body as well. You have respiratory systems, you have cardiovascular systems, et cetera. And these all interact. And it's that part that we bring to the forefront when we talk about systems of systems. So they're complex adaptive systems of systems, or CASoS. Many examples. In fact, when you start thinking about this, it's almost everything you're interested in. Agro-ecosystems, tropical rainforests, I like them. Cities, megacities, infrastructure, as I mentioned, but also all the governmental and political systems, educational systems, all the way through this. to things like thinking about the global energy system. These are all CASoS. So with that in mind, what you'd like to do, what we wanted to do is turn around and think about how to solve problems within these, and that's what the engineering would be. And the best solutions might be complex adaptive systems themselves that are imposed inside and actually react and change and adapt to the situations as they arise. Now, what I'm going to go through is an example of where we came up with a solution that was made use of, and it was done under fairly high, what should I say, rapid turnaround, and a fair amount of high pressure. And in fact, this one and the other one, which I'll mention right afterwards, were sort of the clarifying events that got us really thinking about going in this direction of actually engineering in this area. The example I'm going to tell you about is about the pandemic. I don't know if anyone remembers back in 2005. Okay, there was H5 around, and they've just designed a way. We paid money to have people to people, person to person. But out there in the wild, it still doesn't. But in 2005, Bush read a book, and he was very concerned about this, as was a number of people. And on Halloween 2005, NISAC got a call. Okay, that call came from DHS, and they were concerned. If this could jump species, it might be like 1918, and we'd have 50 million people. That's what it killed last time this kind of thing was let loose. And you know, what are we going to do on this planet? A lot more people might die. So they asked us to put together a briefing package for Secretary Chertoff. Now, when you have a pandemic, you really have no vaccine. Okay, and you have no antiviral. We didn't have any antiviral at the time. The rest of the world had Europe had antiviral, but they bought it all up, okay, way before the United States could buy it and could make policy decision to do so. So this was a situation, pandemic now and no vaccine or antiviral. And at the time, we were studying a lot of other things. We weren't really studying this problem. We were studying power grids and Fedwire, that's the system, payment system, where all our money moves around on a daily basis, and from here to other payment systems across the world. And we're looking at things like contagious transfer of ideas, and we're looking at civil disobedience. And in all these systems, we were seeing cascades and emergence of power laws and fractals, et cetera. And what we were interested in is figuring out ways of taking corrective action. So we were then presented with this problem. First, you look at it and well, okay, it's a system. How is it a system? It was a global transmission network. Person-to-person interactions beginning from a point of origin. Gee, where would that point of origin be? Systems of systems. People belong to many interacting groups, households, et cetera, workplaces. Then there are many different kinds of healthcare systems. There are different corporations, governments, all placing control on the interactions at larger scales. It's complex. There are billions of people on the planet. And it's adaptive. Not only is each culture different, it behaves to things such as diseases, but the bug itself adapts over time. So it's when you think about all this, there's this huge uncertainty. And at the time, many people were just grappling with this huge uncertainty and were unable to make decisions. How could we actually move ahead and, as I say, avert the carnage? We took a big step backwards, and we started thinking like most people in complex models, the simple things. And the best analogy that's been studied more than almost anything else has been forest fires, and it's very similar. And there are two kinds of approaches for stopping forest fires. One uses, well, there are several, but two main ones. One is to build breaks, okay? And the other one is to thin the forest, okay? And if you thin the forest, then it doesn't matter where it would be that spark would rise or that lightning bolt would hit. and you wouldn't, it doesn't matter, and you wouldn't get a percolating event. Okay, so the definition when you look at that is to basically think in terms of analogy on how a bug moves or a virus, and now we get to targeting the social network, the contact network, okay, and can we thin it just like thinning the forest, and then doing it intelligently so that it didn't minimize, it would minimize the impact and keep the economy rolling. And so that's how we pose the problem. And so focus on local community mitigation. What this does is it removes a huge amount of uncertainty. You don't have to care about where it comes from. You just have to come up with an approach which, when you find it in your community, you can impose and then immediately dampen the movement of the pandemic. So you don't even have to worry about how it moves across the planet. You just have to have an approach that you can apply right there. So we then, as good complex systems people, we just took a generic agent-based approach and put together a social network. And in fact, this was one that was designed by my daughter, who was at the time, I think she was a 9th grader or a 10th grader. And she helped build this. And she put school classes in there. This is an example teen. So we did it in a way that was different than saying, take an ideal network and put it out there as a scale-free or as something else. No, what we did was we said, okay, what are the groups that people belong to? Because I could go ask people that. And then I could ask, so how many people do you really interact with in that group? And those become the links that a person would have. And then how many groups do you belong to? And then you hook up an entire community this way. And what's neat about it is it's believable to the people who care about this, okay? And you can ask them. So you do that, and then on top of that, you put basically a disease manifestation for how the disease, a state machine, which moves, the disease progresses inside of a person, and it changes the infectivity and other things as time goes on. This you can pull right from the literature. There are some parameters you have to work with, but or vary, but that's what you do. And you also get the amount of time that people spend in the groups, and that helps helps you tune the frequency to something that's reasonable, scaled across the system. So with that, basically, this is an example where basically we had only one tuning parameter. This is a spread of from a particular person. This is how that network forms of. You had one tumor, and that was simply the infectivity of the disease. And that's the thing that you almost never know until something breaks out. Okay, so this is what you get, and it basically hit numbers for past pandemics right on the head in terms of the numbers of each age class that gets sick. So this was our essential validation. If you look at the details of this contact network, now we get into mitigation, is that you find that almost all of the red zones there are at the backbone of this network, and they're almost all composed of children and teens, okay? And on the edges are the adults, okay? So at the ends of the network are the adults. That's where the epidemic dies out. We don't have as much contact as kids and teens do in school, or the intense contact at home between siblings. When you think then about what you might be able to do, which gets down to, okay, let's close the schools. So if you close the schools, and what you find is, let's look at that, the blue line, the top blue line, is one where you don't do anything. And this line right here is closing schools, this purplish line right here. But if you close schools and keep the kids home, at 50% compliance, you get this yellow line, and if you were able to do it at 100% compliance, you do this. So I ran this, and here's one with a ID factor is simply the infectivity, and this is one like a 1918, the one on the bottom. The one at the top is like a 1958 pandemic. This is what I ran, and I ran this, put this model together fairly quickly, and we had about 6 weeks to do this, to pull it together for this briefing package. I wrote this stuff up, got it in the briefing package, and it went off to Secretary Chertoff. Now, of course, he was barraged with so much information for this that it basically got washed out, as you can imagine. And what did they spend all their time doing at this tabletop? They spent all their time talking about closing borders. Okay, that's exactly what doesn't work real well for fires. Okay, those are the fire breaks. And they just simply don't talk. They immediately stop economic flows. Do you know what that would do? Okay, if we stopped all the flow of goods from China into the country, I mean, incredible. So, and then, in addition, while this was going on in weeks there in December, there were all of these people doing these massive models of people moving around, and at the scale of the whole United States, and beautiful graphics, and they're getting published in Science and Nature, and they're basically saying that there's nothing you can do without antivirals, okay? Yet here is a solution that could be applied anywhere, okay? Understand the social network, take it apart in a realistic fashion, and place a way that would work, and then impose it, that kind of thing. So, why didn't these other epidemiologists figure out this? They didn't figure it out because they didn't have tools which were focused on the problem. Okay, they had tools which were built for other purposes, the understanding of the movement of an infectious disease without the purpose of trying to stop it. Okay, and keep that in mind for the end of the talk. So I felt I needed to influence public policy and do it quickly. This was now December. I'd started on October 31st. This was mid-December. I didn't know what to do, frankly. So I did what a good scientist does. They pull it together and submit to the most rapid journal, highest science. It was rejected. It took 2 weeks for them to reject that. It didn't get sent out to review. I tried to enlist the help of these big names. I sent all the work to them and said, look, we need to do something. Here it is. How can you help? Can we work together? No response. They didn't reply. Then I got really worried, and then I got pissed, okay? And then I said, I'm going to do something that, science, at least in my age, you just don't do. I'm going to use my influence network, my social contact network, and I'm going to figure out who I can send this to, and I'm going to go around the system. I'm not going to go up to Chertoff through the chain of command. I'm going to go around the system to whomever needs it so that they can get it, shove it in. And I did that. And I sent this report. I first of all got it reviewed so I could get it out, and that was pretty quick. And I sent it to an acquaintance at the VA, who sent it to a colleague who was at the VA's representative on the White House Homeland Security Council's Pandemic Implementation Plan writing team. That's the people who are dealing with this problem. Okay, who sent it to the team lead, who sent it to the senior director for biodefense policy in the country, who talked with Bush on a daily basis. Okay, so that's what happened, and it happened within about half a day. Okay, half a day. 4 degrees of separation. I didn't know I had that. And I got on a plane, and after a 4-hour presentation that was only supposed to last an hour, okay, we had figured out what to do. I'd convinced them completely by showing them other examples that we'd been, hey, look, this is a cool approach. It's not an approach that anyone's using in epidemiology at the time, but this is a neat approach. It's coming from complex systems. It's kind of cool, and they liked that. They saw these other ways it was being used. I had credibility coming from Sandia. And within, like I say, 4 hours with this group, which had all those people I just mentioned before in it, and they didn't leave the room the entire time. Meanwhile, the secretaries are coming by and knocking, trying to pull them out. And we had figured out what to do. We were going to work on this. And this is what I had to do. A whole series of things in it to be able to look at these things, and then basically came up with the answers to all of these questions. It took me a year to go through it for real afterwards so I could publish it. But I could get this done, and I could work with them. So they would be calling every day, and this happened for several months. They would call every morning on, it was the end of the day, their end of the day. They would call about all the things that come up in the day, and then all night long I would work. The computer would hum underneath my bed, And then, because I just slept in my studio, and then I would get the results for them the next morning. So, then I extended this to Sandia's 10,000 node cluster to do this thing right, and these were the things that, as we worked out this problem, we were able to do. First was, what is the best mitigation strategy combination? We were able to get that answer. How robust that combination was to model assumptions. So that's robustness of choice with respect to model uncertainty. And what is required for the choice to be most effective? And that means, how do you increase compliance? What could you do to do that? Those are critical enablers of system resilience. So we went through that. Meanwhile, okay, so this is the first bullet that I did. That was what I just described, and I wrote that paper up and got it out as quickly as possible. That's not the full study, that's the initial study. Then we looked at they started socializing this. So it was like having people listen to you, and you would speak complex system speak or whatever speak you want to say you're speaking, and they would interpret it and put it back in the appropriate language that they needed in order to be able to go out and convince others. And these people don't speak our language, believe me. People in the health area, they speak an entire different language. The words mean different things to them. And I would say words, but they can't say that. And anyway, they went into it. In fact, all the drawings on those networks, the red and the black, that was done by people at the White House who took my view graph, and I said, of course you can see this, and they had to put those things on it. It was a great idea. And they allowed them to go out and essentially communicate this to a wide range of people. There were 6 or 7 different departments that were represented in this team at the Homeland Security Council. So you can imagine the diversity that had to be convinced, and the inertia behind that. They forced all those people who wouldn't talk to me to actually go out and reproduce my results with their big models. And so they adjusted them, and they did that, and they managed to get this out and publish it, so they got something out of it. And we looked at triggers and whistles that were systematically evaluated with Vicky Davey. In other words, understanding when to turn it on, when to start the measures, and when to stop, and what happens if you stop them too soon, so that you can understand the length of time that you have to keep them involved, keep them imposed. And then another group of people, using people at Harvard and John Hopkins, went out and actually did a whole bunch of epidemiological forensics to try to understand whether or not any of these measures worked in the past. And then a comprehensive survey-based method was done by my daughter, Laura, and went out and surveyed kids in schools systematically, and this was published also, to get the social contact network right, at least for kids and teenagers, which seemed to be the ones that were most important. And finally, a comprehensive study of the influence of pandemics on critical infrastructure was induced, or conducted. And that was money that came back to NISAC to do that. This all culminated in an Institute of Medicine review. Everyone know what an Institute of Medicine is? It's like the National Academies of Science, but in medicine. And so what they do is they come up with a panel of people who review things, and you put that forward, and then they do this interrogation. People come and present. I presented. A number of other people presented, and these then were evaluated by this group to decide whether or not they were strong enough to be able to form public policy with. And indeed, in February 1st, 2007. So that was a little over a year and a quarter after we started this. Finally, this came out. That's almost a record time for doing something like this. It came out from the CDC, and we published a whole slew of papers on this to give credibility to the work. Now, the other example I just have one slide for, but it was a similar thing. It was going almost concurrently, so we were very busy. And it was looking at payment systems. As I mentioned earlier, $3 trillion or so move through the payment system in the United States a day. every day. And if there's a problem with that system, it's a big problem, okay? And this system is run by the Fed, okay? And so this is something, every bank has a bank account in at the Fed that allows, and they have to keep a certain amount of money in it. That's the liquidity that they're required and that the Fed imposes. And if they don't have all the money that they're supposed to have at the end of the day, then they need to borrow it. And that's the overnight interest rate that everyone talks about that they control as well. So they have two levers on this. Well, I won't go into the details of all of the machinations along the way, but essentially we started with this group, and the first thing we did was we looked at the data associated with who gives money to who in the banks. And what turns out is that of course, you can't see much to begin with. It's sort of a hairball when you take all the data together. But when you start essentially sieving and refining it, what you find is that see these banks right here? There are 20 of them. And it's a fully connected kernel. And that fully connected kernel are all the big banks in the United States. And they are fully connected, and some very large, these are flows by the width. And then the rest of the 7,000 or so banks out there form this nice scale-free network beyond. So you have this kernel right here, and of course, if you do simulations of taking any one of these banks down, you find that this entire system just collapses very quickly. So that was the first thing that we worked with them. Then we put together a little model of how banks actually move money around, how they behave. And then we started looking at these levers of liquidity and interest rate to understand how you might be able to use them to make sure that the system ran smoothly. I won't talk too much about that. And then we got a lot of people excited all over the world, actually, and we started working with payment system specialists in Europe and started connecting these two, the Euro system with the US system, through an FX market. And that was actually going on in 2007, and we were presenting results which showed that if you did monetary policy over in here, change things like I'm saying, interest or other things associated with this exchange process here, then to reduce the risk of forfeiture in the United States, then you'd push that risk over here. And then they would respond by doing something and it would force it back over here. So you get this sort of whipsaw kind of thing going back and forth. And we were presenting that just as the credit crunch came out in 2007, where that's exactly what you saw happen. And the way to deal with this is coordination, and coordination indeed ensued within a week. That was the right thing to do, and besides, some of the people were in the audience listening. So we published a bunch of stuff on that as well. Based on those two examples, we took a step back and said, you know, we really ought to, we're doing other things too, but what we really ought to do is focus on the similarities of these two problems and others to see if we couldn't pull together what you would call a systemization or a new area of endeavor, which we called CASoS Engineering. And that's what we've done. And right now we have funding from a wide range of projects that go all the way from DOE to FDA. And there are about 30 people that are involved in this. And let's see, this doesn't work as a mouse on here. So I can't click this to show you the website. But if you go to the website, there are about 10 or about 20 different applications that you can go into work we're currently doing. These are the kinds of aspirations we have, though. They aren't what we're able to focus on right now, but I think it's where we need to be moving, not just ourselves, but everyone else who would like to work in this. You go to The Economist, and every week it seems like there's a problem right on the front that is cool and something that we ought to be able to, as complex system people, to move into and understand and design. with mitigation or better ways of doing things. Cyber war. These are just a whole set. I'll go through them. I just pulled these out. This is over the course of, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. Currency wars. Climate change. So these are all. I stopped, I guess, when Greece went down. It didn't go down, really. But the thing is, these are the questions that I believe that we should be aspiring to look at. This is briefly what I've been working to do at Stanford this year. It's in the auspices of the CSAC, which is the Center for International Security and Cooperation. They've mainly looked at things like nuclear proliferation and things like that. But over the past few years, they've been building up other areas that you could consider security, like food security and other things. And what I think you should be doing is basically looking at redefining security as being multi-component, a variety of things that you need to have for to secure your security. And that starts with doing a model of economics. So building this model of a series of nations that have inside of them in sectors this kind of structure that evolves naturally, and then they trade with each other to form trading blocks, and then you move that to things which are at global scale. And then what you do is you impose a series of security policies and ask what they do to national and global prosperity, because that's the thing we often don't think about. It costs money to secure things. If you optimize for security, well, you don't have a lot of other things to spend money on. Your prosperity goes down. So these things are a balance, and one needs to look at that carefully. So that's part of what I'm doing this year. I want to end with a set of slides that I put together for an NSF workshop a couple years ago that was on uncertain complex systems, or uncertainty in complex systems, or something like, I can't remember right now. But they asked me to talk, and these are what we found out, I would say, the challenges, and then some approaches for solving those challenges. And the first approach, or the first challenge, is finding the right model. Okay, when you're trying to do this kind of thing, you've got to have the model fit what it is you're trying to do. You can't pull something from the shelf usually. And a model is something that describes a system for a purpose, okay? Even if you're doing science with the model, it's still for a purpose. It's of understanding some aspect of it. And that flavors how you design that model. So you take the system and you have a set of what things you care about, and you have a set of things that you can do. In my case, that's the wanting to change or engineer inside of it. And then what you put together the simplest model that connects those two. Think of it as a network between those two. And it's an incredibly invigorating thing to do. It means that you're modeling something from scratch each time. You're getting outside of your area of expertise often, and it's liberating. So, and what you do is you only add going with people who understand the system, you ask, does this behave correctly? Can I answer the question? And then you go up a level until things stop changing. And that's essentially what I did with that White House group with the pandemic. They had all those questions. Well, it turned out that most of them didn't matter, okay? And it turned out that I really had the kernel correct. It would have been better, I think, if we had started together on the same platform, but I don't know how it would have gotten in the office. So sometimes you have to build a scratcher to be able to get in. The next challenge is uncertainty, and the aspects of uncertainty in these systems are several. One is that they're often have aspects of complex systems, which means they have a signal that's very, very similar to a BTW sand pile. This is irreducible uncertainty, okay? And it's going to have a certain signature to it. You also have adaptation, learning, and innovation in almost every one of these systems. And you either have to figure out how to basically do a separation of time where the time scales on which these are happening are not important for the question that you're looking at, or you have to go into actually bringing them into how you model the system. The third one is what I would call really, really hard. And it's the part about getting the model right. And it's the conceptual model or structural uncertainty. What I mean by that is it has to have the proper equations. And the equations have to be of proper form. They don't necessarily have to have the right coefficients. Okay, those coefficients are the things that you can figure out and go and measure. But it's got to have the right form. It can't be a convective equation, so to speak, when it's a diffusive process. Okay, so you have to get that straight, and it's beyond the parameters, and it's beyond the initial and boundary conditions that most people worry about in uncertainty to begin with. They think of going out and measuring parameters, and I'm saying that most of the problems in what I've just described come from this kind of uncertainty. So how do you deal with that? So this is the approach that we use. Basically, this is just a simple systems flow diagram for how you have aspirations, you define the conceptual model, then you define the analyses, you evaluate the performance of the model. If it's satisfactory, you're done. If it isn't, you go down and you have to go back to one of these other stages, right? So bringing uncertainty into this, you use it in terms of how you develop the model itself. As you go to evaluate the performance, if you have a performance measure right here, that's the red arrow right here, and you find that when you take one action that your distribution, because you're running this with a variety of, you've brought in error or uncertainty in terms of parameters, you've maybe even changed the structural aspects of the model, et cetera. This is what you have, and you look at two things that you could do. Those are those two levers. And you find that they're actually separable. Then, in a sense, you're done. These are clearly distinguishable. Okay? You may have to convince people that your model is valid, et cetera, but they're clearly distinguishable. If they aren't, such as this, then that means you need to go back and essentially work towards reducing uncertainty. And this is the approach that we're using. I don't think it's very new. It's just that it's something that we believe so far is working. The second thing that I want to talk about on the approach is let pragmatic drive for detail. Let what you do be driven by pragmatism. Okay, and sometimes more can be less. So this is a very heuristic plot, okay? There you've got the amount on the x-axis or the y-axis, and you've got model detail on the right. And everyone knows that as you put in model detail, the cost of doing this modeling just goes up, and I've just drawn an exponential curve here. Also what happens is, and I've just drawn a line, is your chance of error goes up too, because you've got so much more detail, so many more parameters, you've got all kinds of things. Plus, it's a big model often, and that means that you've got so many things to look at, and you often don't know what's doing anything. The coverage of model space or parameter space goes down as your ability to cover it all just goes through the floor. And finally, your understanding in many ways drops because you bring in so many things you can't tell what's driving what. So this is sort of what's happening when you're trying to figure out how to build models. You're confronted with this kind of thing, and so you have to recognize this trade-off between detail and what you get from it, and characterize the uncertainty, and you need to buy detail when and where it's needed. And this is something that you have to do It's an art right now. All right, summarizing across all these applications, including many others that I haven't shown you, is that I believe that model-based design of influence can be effective, but it requires a set of things. First is that you need to have policymakers. Those who are going to use the results, they've got to own the model. That's what we've found. You can't just march in there with results and they're fully baked and it's a complicated thing and they haven't been involved in trying to test it and understand it and push it for them to accept it and make use of it. They have to own it in some sense. The second is that the models have to be simple as possible. Otherwise, they're unintelligible, that you can't communicate them to anybody, you can't get their buy-in. You're not talking to people like us in this world. You're talking to policymakers, okay? Third, they need to be causal and dynamic, okay? That means that you need to be thinking about process and putting process into them, because that can be explained. Correlations or trying to make a statistical model is very difficult to convince other people with. Models need to be problem specific and connect means, the policy, and the ends. And I just mentioned system health as a possible end. Uncertainty quantification needs to be used to evaluate and build the models. And the models essentially are used to rank policy choices, to find those whose choice is robust to uncertainty. Not that you hit the right numbers, okay, that relative to one policy to another, you show the relative difference right. Okay, and finally, you have to recognize when you're actually done with trying to do something like this that anything you implement is going to change the system that you impose it in. And so you have to be ready for that. And what that means when you start this thing is it's a giant feedback loop. If you set this up and you're working with policymakers with this kind of thing, and then you've got to then put in essentially sensors to be able to understand how that system's doing in time, and then you have to never be left out of the loop in some sense. It's a job security, right? Anyway, so thanks. This is the group and the funders who have helped along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. That was very interesting overview of the whole thing. It seems to me that perhaps the most complicated policy-associated example of that one could think of would be the thing associated with global warming.
With what?
Global warming? Sorry, my accent. Global warming. Yeah. Because here, you know, the policymakers are trying to figure out what to do in the face of a phenomenon which may or may not exist and nobody can decide because I think they can't model it accurately enough to really know. And so I don't quite know what you do about this, except that the notion that the policymakers would own the model, I think, is critical. Because people often ask me, you know, my friends will ask me what I think about global warming because they know I'm a scientist, and I realize I have to say I have no clue. Because I have no ownership of the data. It sure looks like it's hot outside, but I have no concept myself of what the cause and effect relationships are there. So how do you get something like that across to policymakers who aren't even much of the time trained as scientists?
Well, I think that they have to, as you say, own, and I said own the model. Let me just say in that area, you had problems also with the scientific community 2 years ago. And what they did was they pulled together to own a model themselves, or a set of models, which they worked together to create as a group. And that's a good example, actually, of this kind of thing in action, but for the scientific side. Now, for the policy side, the same thing has to take place, I believe. And the thing I mentioned at Stanford that I'm doing this year is actually a stepping stone in that direction, my own little step, which basically with the model that I'm putting together, and I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, the idea is to look at slow and driven changes, and then to understand how that influences then the choices that people should make for security. And security means food and energy and all these things which we care about, and the cost effectiveness of those things you do. And so one of the policies ought to be considered is basically a reduction of CO2 in greenhouse gases. Or it might be geoengineering. And it might be, dealing with acidification of the ocean directly. It could be a lot of things that you could try. So that's a tough problem, probably the toughest one that we've got, yeah. Take years.
So I really enjoyed your talk, and I just wanted to make one comment that the scientific community working on climate change, they really do look at these big models as their laboratory, right? Because they don't get to go out in the world and tune knobs. And all the most simple models and all the complex models, they have uncertainty in the predictions that they make, but the community itself is quite certain that the Earth is changing, getting warmer because of human activity. And that's widely agreed upon within the community of people, not the policymakers, but the community of people doing the modeling. So I wanted to make that point first, but I also wanted to say there are lots of students here, and students who work with simple models and try and understand results that they get in simple models and how they translate to the real world. And you gave a fantastic example of how you were able to show results from a simple model, and you were fortunate enough that when they were put into the big complex model, you got something that was consistent. And sometimes that doesn't happen. So I was hoping you could comment on, the reliance on simple models to, get you understanding in a time when computers are actually able to give us models that maybe do much better at predicting what happens in the real world when you go and look at data. But the models that the computers can give us from, evolutionary algorithms and such aren't necessarily intelligible. So I'm wondering if you could comment on you mentioned understanding is crucial. Simple models are crucial. What is the world going to look like 10 years from now when the models we have that best describe our observations of the world aren't intelligible, but they predict much better than the ones we derive from first principles?
Yeah, I think it'll place us in a great quandary, because what you're really doing is you're creating, it's sort of like people will be ordained in being able to use some of these very complicated models and the results that they give, with possibly not understanding, because they didn't build them, the details down inside. And what happens with that kind of thing is that people will apply them to situations where they don't apply. And we're going to be in a quandary there. And we see that in the past many times, right? So the thing I'm trying to say by simple models, it's as simple as possible to be able to meet your objectives. So that doesn't mean that it's as simple as I showed you, because it might have to be more complicated. But it needs to be as simple as possible for a variety of things. One is being able to understand the results, and that's also important for just a stepping stone towards refinement, okay? But it also needs to be that for communicating. So these models that I'm talking about often, they're focused on policy here and design of policy, influence in these kinds of systems. You need them so that they still, for the thing you're trying to do, even the complicated model would reduce down to it. Okay, in terms of evaluating the various policies. Okay, and if they don't, if you find that out over time, then you need to go back and revise. And that's what I said, you get in this big loop. But if it isn't done simply, you won't be able to talk to everyone. And policy is in the hands of everyone. Well, sort of, but certainly the people who are the policymakers are, as I said, not like you or I.
I have a question and a comment. During the same years, I saw many models in science and nature for example, from Vespignani and others on spread of diseases. How you would comment on those, and what are the major differences between your approach and the approach which was widely popularized during the same period? And the comment is that while you were interacting with the government and the agencies, your suggestion to close the schools is something what governments in Europe do all the time whenever a disease shows up. So even in my childhood, they closed when there were much more diseases like measles. I don't know. They always closed the schools, even in
Yeah, so it makes
countries.
sense, right?
So what is,
Does it make sense to you, right?
Yes.
Yes, makes sense. But the thing that you need to do is to query whether or not that sense that comes from, you know, somewhat experience but very little quantitative analysis is correct or not. So no doubt that was one of the things that helped with this and helped sensitize. But I have to tell you that in this country, there was huge response to not doing that. So the Department of Education stood up and said that they can't do it. By law, we can't do this. We might be, by doing that, we might be infringing upon the rights of students, people in the community, et cetera, by doing this kind of thing. So there were a lot of pushback on this, and was a lot of pushback by families too. Because guess what? That means somebody, if you're going to keep the kids at home, somebody's got to stay with them. Okay, so that's a difficulty, and it's an economic problem. Well, all of these things can be solved, right? If you appropriately put in place other measures. Okay, so I think it was the right thing. I think you're saying it was the obvious thing, and I agree. But it was what we got in. Now with the layered, what was it called? TLC, targeted layered containment. That was something where you build upon that with a set of other things, and that's what we came up with in addition. So it wasn't just school closure, it was a whole set of other measures depending on how infectious the disease was, to be able to understand the appropriate set of things to do, okay, for a set of, for normal situations in the United States. Your earlier comment was, you know, how does this model differ from other models? I wasn't sure of the model that you were mentioning, if there were things like what Longini put together with folks at LANL, which was basically a molecular model which allowed people to move between a series of groups, or EpiSIMS in this country that was doing the same kind of thing, modeling people in Chicago and other places, all their daily activities. Then those models weren't focused on the simple things of just the contact network. And there were so many knobs to work with on those that they're, in a sense, you're blinded. And that's what I'm trying to say about keeping things simple as long as possible. I didn't understand who you were talking about. Couldn't hear. Yeah.
So I guess my question is that about, it seems like what you're doing is definitely the right approach to validating models and making sure that they're right in this feedback loop. But how do you counter the forces of certain vested interests that might be producing bad science because they have an interest in it? How do you, if you're trying to influence policy, prevent someone who knows how to manipulate a model and get the result they want from doing that?
Whoa, well, I don't know how to prevent my kids from doing a lot of things. I think that what's required is not the prevention of people doing harmful or things which they know are not correct. They might even believe that it's correct, for all I know. What's required is the kind of scrutiny that you go through with whoever really owns the system, and and them asking for independent corroboration or forcing it, and a set of other things that need to be done. If you're in a position where opinion is all that seems to be floating, then you have to, I think you take another entire approach to moving the system in your direction. And it probably doesn't have to do with getting a better model.
How do you ensure that your models are dynamic enough and adaptive enough that things like the law of unintended consequences doesn't send your models off into a tailspin or a spiral? For example, for what you showed earlier, I can imagine after 2 weeks of the kids being home at school, the local pubs could be full of the husbands trying to get away from their families and create a whole nother socio-economic place for these diseases to be spread amongst these families that is completely not contained in the model as it's shown now. How do you ensure that the models can take those things into effect, or into consideration quickly enough to prevent things like that from happening?
Yeah, you're right. Let me just say that after this is a very simple and quick analysis, but it was done extremely thoroughly. After that was done, of course, many people came back with, well, but let's build a behavioral model where people can modify what they do, et cetera. Okay, so, and there's a lot of argument for doing that. Here's what I have to say about that, and you're answering you, is that we all know what to do, and these behavioral things. We all know what to do when the fire alarm goes off, right? Right? How do we know that? Because we've been trained since little kids with fire drills, and it becomes second nature. Okay, so I believe that the same thing for pandemics should be done, or all infectious diseases should be done in part of the curriculum from kindergarten on, very simply, and getting people to understand their social contact networks. And it can be done, and my daughter did this in class, and it's amazing. If you go through the little survey, all these kids understood it like that. You know, and from then on, I think that we've changed their lives in terms of how they would respond to any infectious disease that came on. So it's a matter of understanding that things do get transmitted and how, so that you give that to the entire population, and we need to train everyone to do this throughout their lives. So if it happened today, there'd be all kinds of problems and unintended consequences from implementing this kind of thing. You would need to explain it to people and then go in there heavily and try to tell them what this means is closing schools mean that the kids do stay home, okay? That somebody has to stay home with them, that person gets compensated either through insurance through the company or through the government, that the people need to stay there. They can use their computers and their cell phones and everything else to communicate. And maybe we can allow a few other exchanges. But, you know, and adults, they need to be kept, they can't do anything that they haven't already been doing. And that was something that somebody, you know, you mentioned something they hadn't already been doing. And so that's essentially what you would have to say and then get across. And then essentially police now. But I believe that you can change things through education. I mean, we do this, we align people through our educational system. That's what it is, for a whole wide range of things, not just knowledge. And I think that that's something that we can build into how we do business. And this should point, I think, some of the way on that.
I think your example was very compelling for a situation where the problem could be considered sort of convergent. I mean, it's very well defined in advance, and that is to prevent a pandemic, to prevent disease from spreading. And I think the modeling was certainly very, very helpful in simplifying the problem enough to be able to act on it. Do you have any suggestions for moving from that kind of situation where the problem is really fairly well defined in advance to things like global warming, economic policy, mental health problems, where it's hard to define the problem in the first place, or it's hard to get agreement on what the problem is. And there's certainly a lot of urgency about it with respect to economic policy. I mean, right now, the economic policies in Europe, it's as if John Keynes never existed. And a lot of the policies seem very virtuous, but they also seem to be designed to prevent economic growth that would be required to solve the problems. There are people in this country who would like to apply the same kind of medicine. Can you move from the sort of situation that you modeled to these bigger and really very, very urgent kinds of problems with many moving parts? And so global warming would be another one. A lot of mental health issues would be examples too.
Yeah, I think you can. However, I don't think that we are moving that direction quickly enough. And it takes time to build both a set of people who can do this without sidetracking it with, by building models where the results are things that they've preordained and they're not necessarily the ones which that would come out of a model which was unbiased. So I think that on a lot of these very tough problems that you just mentioned, that I'm not sure we're ready for using this approach right now, as we were on these others which are very focused. But I believe we can in the future, and it will come from a large number of people turning to say that one can, and start to proving that you can in these other situations. So we're not there yet. I think that we will in time. So, and that's our aspiration, is to be able to move in that direction. I'll just mention too, the thing that we talked about, or I talked about, that I'm doing as part of the Perry Fellowship at Stanford, is to build that sort of toy model, and then to build a group of people that are very high level to take it over and become the folks that then guide its development, so that it runs together. And that starts looking at some of these very large global problems. And I think that will be a path for doing this in the future. It's always, you need to find the right people to form sort of the thought leaders in an area to converge on deciding that they'll use systems modeling to evaluate their policy.
So I had a couple of things. I think Gabor was talking about Vespignani and maybe Vittorio, maybe he's gone, Vittorio Colizza. This is the airline network models where, is that?
Yeah. Oh, that's great stuff.
Right, okay, yeah. You reduce you have to reduce the flights by 98%.
What are you going to do? You're going to
it's a disaster.
What are you going to do? Stop all
Right.
airline flights? And
Right.
that's what I'm saying. Those are fire breaks.
So that was their finding, was basically it would be to prevent global spreading would be
But my
completely
point is,
just
point is,
calamitous economically.
right,
Yes.
right.
I mean that's what they
Yeah.
were able to show.
But it was really cool stuff. And
Yeah,
you can
right.
see how people move. In fact, it tells you that, yeah, as you say, it tells you can't do it.
Yeah, the connectivity is too high. So, and SARS was a good example, right, where we have these little stories afterwards of someone traveling and these rare events mattered.
Yeah.
And we made a meta-population model, I guess 5 or 6 years ago, which, we were trying to move away from this kind of silly thing of R0 and trying to figure out what the, the reproduction number was of a particular, right, I mean, this very strange idea. But it was exactly in this mode of finding a toy model that, gave us some ideas about things, and we could Now, so I'm trying to come back to the toy model story. Oh, also with fires, right? We do know how to react with fires, but if there's a large crowd of us, then bad things happen. People escaping from burning buildings. I just wanted to add that. In terms of heuristics, it totally breaks down. Dirk Helbing's done all this sort of work and so on, right? I mean, at least from a modeling perspective, and of course, real events, bad things have happened. Anyway, I just wonder when it comes to policy, you know, and you're obviously very successful with you know, your toy model for, or your simplified model for spreading of disease, that you kind of need both ends, right? You sort of need the toy models to give you the ideas and to be sort of clear so you can explain it to other people and you can have your simple story, you can inform yourself. But then you kind of do need those kitchen sink type models. It was Eubank at Lanel, as you said, you know, to give you that, right? I mean, they're important things. I mean, and I agree, them by themselves, those models by themselves are just kind of horrible things. I mean, you don't know what's going on. There are dials all over the place. But if you have both of it, there's sort of nothing in between so much that's very useful. You kind of, these very abstract ones are helpful in terms of communication, getting ideas and so on. Then there's data, right? I mean, there's an analyzing what's happened in the, what I'm trying to say is I don't think you want to just march in again and again with simple toy models of how people behave, you know, like game theory type models and try to, I mean, certainly this has happened in the past with, you know, influencing political behavior. You know, scientists have come in and said, well, my game theory models do this or my simple models do this. Here's the next plan for Poland or whatever it is, right? And it doesn't always turn out well. So I just sort of wonder about, I'm a sort of a toy model type person. I like those things. But it always seems like it's good to have that, you know, kitchen sink thing as well coming in from some other area at least so that you can say, oh, look, we've got all of these pieces and it seems to make sense.
So I don't disagree with that. In fact, that was one of the components of what I showed was part of the process. So, and it was something that then showed that what had been found before was correct. Okay, and so that's the verification, at least, through a more complicated model which included many, many other things in it. Now, I want us to take a step back and talk about this toy model. This toy model had intrinsically in it a social network that everyone could believe in, and you can, with a survey, you can create anyone, one of these anywhere. Okay, and it, I think, has a more fundamental validity than a lot of the movements of the people in these other large-scale models, which are all assumed. Okay, so so I believe that actually it's more valid. Now, at the IOM meeting, Ferguson, who was one of the, he was doing this. Everyone was asked whose model they thought was, and Ferguson said mine. Okay, and Longini, he didn't say anything. And when I was asked, I said, well, I think you need a model with these kinds of things, and if these kinds of things are in the model, then that's the model we should be using. And there were a couple other things I wish I mentioned that weren't in the model that I had, but they weren't in other people's model either. So I believe that from that point of view, I don't think that you may call these toy models, but I disagree. I think that they are intrinsically more sound if you build them correctly, because you leave things out. That's Occam's razor. You leave things out that are unimportant, and then you bring them in to see if they're important at a later step, and you see whether or not they change the rankings. If they do, hey, you got to bring it in, okay? And you do this in every way you can conceivably do in your model by building outward. Okay, that's how you do it. You don't start by all this stuff, the kitchen sink, and then try to whittle it down. It's impossible. Okay, so you can tell I'm an advocate of not toy models, but simple models, and only as simple as required. It can be to answer the question that you need to answer. And there's a huge amount of work you have to grind with to show that. That was the year.
Persisted for 80 years or 90 years
with R0.
With random mixing models.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's just
absolutely.
And
they're
public
still
policy
using
was based on
R0s
that.
every time. I mean, with oh, by the way, what happened at H1N1? Okay, H1N1, they were all worried about fitting the R0 from Mexico. They have, the R0 is a function of the social contact network, which is very different. The way people behave, which is very different. I mean, I don't think in this country we're always going up and hugging people and kissing them all the time. And
Maybe in Vermont.
well, okay, and et cetera. So there's a whole bunch of things that were, I mean, they're all rolled into that R0. It was just,
Exactly, right?
It was just fantastic. I mean, it was fantastical.
So it's this weird artifact of mathematical models from the 20s, and it stayed around, and you should be able to. And also, you know, this desire to describe a system, a complex system with one number, which is a very, very big mistake, right? But it's a nice thing to give to policymakers. So I think that's another thing I want to add. I mean, you know, because when you get it down to simple stories, the simplest story can win. So you have to be careful with that, right? That's obviously the battle you play. You know, and Cameron over here mentioned this before with you know, people bringing in, you know, non-scientific or, you know, ideological based ideas that are simple and perhaps beautiful even to think of, and you know, and people can be attracted to them.
But you have to test them. That was tested. These are the kinds of things that we did with that, and yeah.
So I just want to put a plug in for the social sciences a little bit, and I think there's a lot to be learned in your, I wonder in your conceptual phasing and beginning with the conceptual modeling, what the observation of social phenomena prior to the conceptual model building, and then building out from there, and what value that has in terms of, let's say we're using the concept of pattern-oriented modeling, observing natural phenomena, and then constructing at least the initial simpler models from observed reality, or the availability of data also are a constraining set. So I just want to put that plug in there. But some of us are involved in actually training and working with policymakers or training the next generation of policy analysts, let's say. Do you have any recommendations in terms of what skills or attitudes and values you could give those of us who are trying to till the soil for not the modeling experts, but those that can be receptive to understanding and asking the right kinds of questions, to be more amenable and open to these environments?
I believe that they need to take a series of classes in complex systems.
Okay, we've got that. We do have that. But aside, I mean,
and the other things
are there lower hanging fruit than
I think
not?
that one of the things I believe that the complex systems folks have done that is different than what I've seen any other time, and maybe it was just the timing, but many people coming from the Santa Fe Institute and other places, they wrote these popular books, and I think that they were in many ways extremely useful to the people that you're talking about. And I think that that's been helpful, and I think that they then see it and they can almost educate themselves at that popular level. Now, as you point out, there are lots of take-home messages which don't apply across the board, and so they can be they could misunderstand things. But I think it's been very helpful in gaining purchase. Okay, then so that's good. The next step is to give them more quantitative, and I don't necessarily mean mathematical, but I mean really working with them on building conceptual models. Conceptual models don't need to be, or don't have to move the next step into mathematical formulation. But getting teaching people to do that is, I think, incredibly critical, especially the people that, I mean, everyone in this room, but also people who are of the type that you're describing, because then they can understand. They don't necessarily need to understand the mathematics, the details of it, or the way it's calculated, but they need to understand the relationships. They need to understand the the pieces, how you're conceiving and dividing up the problem into these various entities, say, and what's what's outside and what's in the system, and how to go about doing that, and how to then think about the interrelationships between entities as described, and what those interactions are, positive or negative. One of the best things for them to learn how to do is to build an influence diagram, which is something that's first thing you do when you're building a systems dynamics model, at least, and there's software to help you do that. And whether or not you go the next step of putting in equations which are fundamentally continuous for systems dynamics approaches, or you break up groups and turn them into a set of agents, depends on the problem of interest, resolution that you wish, the kinds of things you need to include, etc. But they can understand all that, I believe, without getting stopped by the equation on the board, okay? And I believe that that's important for that group.
In your epidemic model, you had like a hybrid model where you had a system dynamic version, which was kind of like a disease pattern or inside the brains of those agents, and then you have the network. So it's kind of like an agent-based system dynamic hybrid model, if I think it's one in your slide. So I just want to have a question about where do you see the hybridization of these kind of different modeling approaches going in the long run, like in terms of when you merge system dynamic models with agent-based models or discrete event models?
Yeah.
And how do you kind of align that decision with the problem specification?
Yeah, so this was basically a discrete model completely, and this is put together as a state machine here, and it was not solving a set of differential equations. Okay, but we have done that kind of thing for this kind of system too. And the real question you're asking is this hybridization. So even in systems dynamics, oftentimes you bring in a bunch of logic Boolean now, okay, which makes it a discrete system with primarily continuous equations. So, and many, many equations, lots of equations in there. And in fact, often when you do a distillation of that using phase-based analysis, you find out that actually it's a lot, very few parameters really, I mean, because a lot of things can be lumped, that are really driving your model. But this issue of combining is something which is not, it's an area of research that needs to be done, fundamental research, because whether or not you choose to go discretely in this area or keep a set of equations relative to something else you're doing in your model, in your system, is not well thought through. You use such things as separation of time scale, thinking about it. You should be using such things as essentially dimensional analysis and in terms of time and other things to be able to do that. And I don't see many people doing that. So it's an area that I believe that is one that needs to be gone in detail and in depth for this kind of modeling. It's not out, I haven't seen it out there. Yet we go ahead and still use these and build them. And so you're left with the same problems you had when you were first working with solving differential equations in, Fortran. And you were dealing with, space and time and getting it discretized right and shrinking it down and showing all this stuff, it doesn't matter. And that's what you end up doing a lot of in the verification of these kinds of codes still. And, but there are, as I know, I don't see any great rules yet. It's an area like I think we should be working on. It'd be a great NSF proposal, I think.
So we're out of time. Let's thank Bob for his time and answers. And thank you for coming out, and we'll see you next time.